In February 1912, construction workers for the Brooklyn-Manhattan Transit broke through a brick wall under Broadway and found a room that should not exist. Gas lamps still mounted to frescoed walls. A grand piano, its ivories intact, waiting in the darkness. A wooden passenger car sitting on rails as if the next departure were scheduled for 40 years ago. The air was warm and dry. Nothing had rotted. In the corner, a massive circular shield, 9 feet across, studded with iron, pointed south toward a tunnel that had been dug in secret while the city slept above. The workers had stumbled into Alfred Ely Beach's Pneumatic Subway, a 312-foot palace built beneath the feet of the most corrupt political machine in American history, abandoned when money ran out, sealed when hope died, forgotten when its creator lost his taste for the future. It had cost $350,000 in 1869, Beach's entire fortune. It carried 400,000 passengers in a single year. It operated for 3 years, then vanished from the city's memory as cleanly as if it had never existed. The question the workers faced in 1912, standing in that impossible waiting room, was the same question we face now. Was this tunnel a triumph of American ingenuity, or the most expensive grave ever built for a single man's dream? The Pneumatic Subway station opened to the public on February 26, 1870, and within 2 weeks, 11,000 people had paid 25 cents each to ride a single wooden car through a tunnel the length of a city block. Alfred Ely Beach stood in the waiting room and watched them descend the stairs from street level, their faces shifting from skepticism to wonder. They had entered through the basement of Devlin's clothing store at 260 Broadway, a rented storefront across the street from City Hall, where William McGeer Tweed conducted the business of looting New York. The passengers passed through vacuum-sealed doors into a reception hall that resembled a European salon more than a transit station. Frescoed walls, a fountain with goldfish swimming in illuminated water, chandeliers casting light across upholstered settees, a grand piano in the corner, available for anyone who wished to play while waiting for the car to return from its journey. The tunnel itself was a brick-lined tube, 9 feet in diameter, curving gently from Warren Street south under Broadway to Murray Street. The car fit inside it like a bullet in a barrel. When the conductor pulled a wire, a 48-ton blower nicknamed the Western Tornado forced 100,000 cubic feet of air per minute into the tunnel. The car moved at 10 miles per hour, faster than most of the horse-drawn traffic choking the streets above. At the end of the track, the car tripped another wire. The blower reversed. The air became suction. The car was pulled back to the station, completing the round trip in less than 3 minutes. No smoke, no steam, no coal dust or noise beyond the rush of wind. Just air, compressed and weaponized, doing the work of horses. Beach had built the entire system in 58 days during the winter of 1869, working only at night. His crews excavated under Broadway while the city slept, removing dirt in wagons with muffled wheels, bringing in bricks and rails and machinery under cover of darkness. They used a circular tunneling shield, Beach's own design and improvement on Brunel's rectangular shield, to prevent cave-ins. Workers inside the shield excavated forward, while masons immediately behind them lined the tunnel with brick. To verify their position, they drove jointed iron rods up through the tunnel roof to the pavement, then measured the angle and depth by compass and survey. The secrecy was necessary. Beach had applied for a permit to build a pneumatic tube for mail delivery, 2 small tubes running from Warren to Cedar Street. The permit had been amended by Tweed himself to allow for 1 large tunnel to simplify construction. Beach understood the amendment for what it was: permission to build something Tweed could tax, regulate, and ultimately control. So Beach built his passenger subway instead, funding it entirely from his personal fortune, $350,000, equivalent to roughly $827 million today, and revealed it only when it was complete. Tweed discovered the subway's existence the same day the public did. He was, by all accounts, furious. By 1870, Tweed controlled virtually every lever of power in New York City. He was Grand Sachem of Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that determined who held office, who received city contracts, and who profited from the perpetual construction projects that turned public funds into private fortunes. Between 1869 and 1871 alone, estimates suggest the Tweed Ring stole between $45 million and $200 million from the city. The county courthouse, budgeted at $250,000, had already cost over $8 million by 1871 and remained unfinished. Plasterers were paid $287 million, carpenters received $296 million for furniture. A single thermometer cost the city $7,500. Tweed's wealth was visible in his shirt-front diamond, his Fifth Avenue mansion, his Connecticut estate. His power was visible in the fact that no one could stop him. Not the newspapers, most of which he controlled. Not the courts, which he owned through judicial appointments. Not the police, who worked for mayors he installed. The only threats to his empire were projects he couldn't regulate. And Beach's Pneumatic Subway, built in secret and funded privately, was exactly that kind of threat. The subway represented more than engineering. It represented capital that had bypassed Tammany's toll booths. It represented a future in which rapid transit might develop without Tweed's oversight, without his percentages, without his approval. Worse, it was popular. By the end of its first year, 400,000 people had ridden the pneumatic car, and every one of them returned to street level convinced that underground transit was not only possible, but preferable to the gridlock above. Beach donated all proceeds to the Union Home and School for Soldiers and Sailors' Orphans. It was a strategic choice. He couldn't charge fares under his existing charter. He had only been granted permission to build a mail tube, so he turned the subway into a charity attraction. The gesture was genuine, but it also made Tweed's opposition politically costly. How could Tammany Hall shut down a project that benefited war orphans? The answer, it turned out, was easily. In January 1871, Beach introduced a bill to the New York State Legislature to extend the pneumatic subway from Warren Street all the way to Central Park, a 5-mile route that would transform the demonstration into an actual transit system. The bill called for $5 million in private investment. No public funds, no city contracts, just permission to dig. Tweed introduced his own bill the same month, the Viaduct Plan, a massive elevated railway that would run the length of Manhattan on stone arches 40 feet high. Cost $50 million, with $5 million posted immediately by the state for use in any way the directors saw fit. The viaduct would slice through dozens of city blocks, destroy property values, and require years of construction, all of which would generate contracts, jobs, and opportunities. For graft on a scale even the county courthouse couldn't match. Both bills arrived on the desk of Governor John T. Hoffman, a Tweed ally, in early 1871. Hoffman vetoed the Beach Transit Bill. He approved the Viaduct Plan. The stated reason for the veto was that Beach's bill granted too much authority to a private company without adequate compensation to the city or state. The actual reason was that Tweed had ordered it. Hoffman, like most elected officials in New York, understood that his career depended on Tammany's support. Crossing Tweed meant political death. But by mid-1871, Tweed's empire was beginning to crack. The New York Times, one of the few papers he didn't control, published a series of exposés detailing the scale of the ring's corruption. Thomas Nast, the political cartoonist for Harper's Weekly, began producing brutal caricatures that depicted Tweed as a bloated emperor, his pockets stuffed with cash, his Tammany tiger mauling the city. The images were devastating. Most of Tweed's constituents were illiterate Irish immigrants who couldn't read the Times investigations, but they could understand Nast's pictures. In October 1871, Tweed was arrested. By 1873, he was convicted of forgery and larceny and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Beach's bill finally passed in 1873 under a new governor, John A. Dix. But by then, the moment had passed. The economy was collapsing. The Panic of 1873, triggered by the failure of J. Cook and Company and the subsequent stock market crash, wiped out access to capital. Investors who might have funded Beach's expansion were now scrambling to cover their losses. Beach himself had spent his fortune lobbying for legislative approval. There was no money left. Late in 1873, Governor Dix withdrew the charter with the greatest reluctance. The Beach Pneumatic Subway would never extend beyond its single block. Beach sealed the tunnel entrance. The station, located in the basement of the Rogers Peet Building, was repurposed for storage. The building itself burned down in 1898. By then, the subway had been forgotten. Even Beach seemed to have lost interest. Friends noted that his conversations became less sharp, his wit less cutting. He continued his work at Scientific American, but the energy that had driven him to dig a tunnel under Broadway in secret, under the nose of the most powerful political boss in America, was gone. He died on January 1, 1896, at the age of 69, from pneumonia. 16 years later, workers breaking ground for the BMT Broadway line punched through a brick wall and found his waiting room exactly as he had left it. The car, the shield, the piano, all intact, as if the tunnel had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to return. The workers removed the shield and donated it to Cornell University, which promptly lost track of it. The tunnel was destroyed to make way for the new subway. A plaque was eventually placed at the City Hall station, acknowledging Beach as the father of New York subway. But the question remains, what was the Beach Pneumatic Transit really? A proof of concept that validated underground transit and paved the way for the 1904 subway system? Or a $350,000 monument to the impossibility of building anything in New York without Tammany's blessing, a palace built for 400,000 tourists who paid to see what the future might have looked like if only the present had allowed it. The 58 days of construction began on a night in late 1869 when workers descended into the basement of Devlin's clothing store and started digging. We don't have their names. The historical record preserved Beach's name, the names of his financial backers, the names of the politicians who opposed him, but not the names of the men who actually excavated the tunnel. We know they worked at night. We know they removed dirt in wagons with muffled wheels to avoid detection. We know they used Beach's circular tunneling shield to prevent the street from collapsing above them. We know they lined the tunnel with brick as they advanced, working in shifts, finishing the entire 312-foot bore in less than 2 months. What we don't know is how many of them there were, what they were paid, whether any of them were injured, or what happened to them after the tunnel was sealed in 1873. This is not unusual. Labor in the 19th century was generally invisible in official histories unless something went catastrophically wrong, a cave-in, a fire, a strike. The Beach Pneumatic Transit was completed without incident, which means the workers who built it vanished from the record the moment they finished. They were tools, not subjects. The tunnel was Alfred Ely Beach's achievement. The labor that produced it was simply a cost. The only details we have come from Beach's own promotional materials. In 1870, he published an illustrated pamphlet titled Illustrated Description of the Broadway Pneumatic Underground Railway, which included technical drawings of the tunneling shield, cross-sections of the tunnel, and descriptions of the blower system. The pamphlet mentioned that workers used compass and survey to determine their position underground, and that they verified their location by driving jointed iron rods up through the tunnel roof to the pavement. It did not mention how many workers performed this verification, how often they did it, or what happened when the rods encountered obstacles, gas lines, water mains, the foundations of buildings. The shield itself was a marvel of engineering. 9 feet in diameter, circular rather than rectangular, with a cutting edge at the front and hydraulic rams that pushed it forward while workers excavated the earth inside. Behind the shield, masons immediately bricked the tunnel walls to prevent collapse. The design minimized surface disruption, critical when digging directly under Broadway, one of the busiest streets in New York. But the shield also required workers to labor in an extremely confined space, in near-total darkness, with no ventilation beyond what filtered down from the basement entrance. The tunnel curved. It had to. It began under Warren Street, angled east into Broadway, then curved south down the middle of Broadway to Murray Street. The curve was completed in March 1869, a 90-degree turn, lined with cast-iron plates rather than brick. Turning a 9-foot tunneling shield through a 90-degree curve without disturbing the street above would have required extraordinary precision and physical effort. The historical record notes that 6 months were required to complete the curve. It does not note how many workers were involved, how many hours they worked per shift, or whether the 6-month timeline included delays for accidents or equipment failures. Once the curve was finished, the straight section to Murray Street was completed quickly, fast enough to open the subway to the public on February 26, 1870. This suggests that either the workforce increased significantly after the curve was completed, or the workers were pushed to accelerate the pace. Either way, someone made the decision, someone allocated resources, someone determined that the tunnel needed to open in February rather than March or April. That decision shaped the labor conditions for the final months of construction, but the decision-maker's name and the workers' response are absent from the archive. The blower system required different labor. The Western Tornado, a 48-ton Roots blower powered by a 100-horsepower steam engine, had to be installed, tested, and calibrated. This wasn't excavation work, it was mechanical engineering. Someone had to assemble the engine, someone had to connect the blower to the tunnel, someone had to test the system repeatedly to ensure the air pressure was sufficient to move the car, but not so strong it would derail or damage it. These workers would have been skilled tradesmen, machinists, engineers, mechanics, likely paid more than the excavation crews, but still unnamed in the historical record. Then there was the waiting room, the frescoes on the walls, the fountain with goldfish, the chandeliers, the grand piano, the upholstered settees. All of this required different kinds of labor: painters, carpenters, plumbers, decorators, musicians. Someone had to deliver and tune the piano. Beach spared no expense on the station's aesthetics, understanding that public perception depended on spectacle. The station needed to look like the future, clean, elegant, luxurious, to contrast with the filthy, chaotic streets above. But creating that illusion required invisible labor. The workers who painted the frescoes and installed the fountain were erased the moment their work was complete, replaced in public memory by the frescoes and fountain themselves. We know the total cost, $350,000. We don't know how much of that went to labor. Construction materials, bricks, cast iron, timber for the shield, would have consumed a significant portion. So would the blower system and the steam engine. Beach's own time as designer and project manager had value, though he wasn't paying himself a salary. But even a rough estimate suggests that tens of thousands of dollars went to wages. Split among dozens of workers over 58 days, this could mean decent pay for skilled work, or it could mean brutal hours at minimal wages, depending on how many workers were employed and what kind of leverage they had. They had no leverage. This was 1869. Labor unions existed, but they were weak and fragmented. The workers who built the Beach Pneumatic Transit had no legal protections, no workplace safety regulations, no recourse if they were injured or underpaid. If they complained, they could be replaced. If they tried to organize, they could be blacklisted. The only power they had was the power to quit. And in a city with 700,000 people, crammed into lower Manhattan, with thousands of immigrants arriving daily, quitting meant someone else would take the job within hours. So they worked. They dug, they bricked, they assembled machinery, they painted walls. And when the work was done, they disappeared. In 1912, when workers excavating for the BMT Broadway line broke through into Beach's tunnel, they found the car, the shield, and the piano, but no record of who had placed them there. The new workers were performing the same kind of labor the original crews had performed 43 years earlier, digging tunnels under Broadway, risking cave-ins, working in confined spaces with inadequate ventilation. The main difference was that by 1912, labor conditions were slightly better. Unions had gained some ground. Safety regulations existed on paper, if not always in practice. But the work itself was fundamentally unchanged. Tunnels still required human bodies in dangerous spaces, doing work that machines couldn't yet perform. The Broadway line workers sued the city for destroying Beach's tunnel, claiming it was still the property of the Beach Pneumatic Transit Company. The outcome of the lawsuit is unknown, another gap in the record, but the lawsuit itself is revealing. The workers who built the BMT line understood that the Beach Tunnel had value, that it represented someone's property, someone's investment. What they may not have understood, what the historical record makes clear, is that the tunnel's value had never included the value of the labor that created it. Beach's fortune, $350,000, purchased a tunnel, a car, a blower, a waiting room with goldfish and chandeliers. It did not purchase recognition for the workers who built those things. Their names, their hours, their injuries, their wages, all of it was considered operational detail, not historical fact. When the tunnel was rediscovered in 1912, newspapers marveled at Beach's ingenuity, his vision, his defiance of Boss Tweed. They did not marvel at the workers who dug through dirt and rock for 58 consecutive nights, who bricked walls in near-total darkness, who risked their lives to build something their employer hoped would change the future. The workers are gone. The tunnel is gone. Even the shield is gone. Lost by Cornell University sometime after 1912, its location unknown, its historical value apparently insufficient to justify careful record-keeping. What remains is a plaque at the City Hall station crediting Alfred Ely Beach as the father of New York's subway. The plaque does not mention the workers. It does not need to. History has already made its decision about whose labor counts. Alfred Ely Beach did not build his tunnel illegally, but he did build it deceptively, and the difference mattered. In 1868, Beach received a charter from the New York State Legislature authorizing the Beach Pneumatic Transit Company to construct pneumatic tubes beneath the streets, squares, avenues, and public spaces of the cities of New York and Brooklyn. The charter was broad, visionary, almost absurdly ambitious. It allowed for tubes under the bed of the North River to New Jersey for the transport of packages, mails, merchandise, and property, and even for the construction of suitable ornamental lamppost boxes, pillars, or receptacles not exceeding 30 inches in diameter, connected to the tubes for depositing letters and parcels. But the charter said nothing about passengers. It was a mail system, not a transit system. In 1869, Beach applied for a more specific permit, authorization to build 2 small pneumatic tubes from Warren Street to Cedar Street for package delivery. Governor John T. Hoffman signed the permit on May 3, 1869. Then, mysteriously, the permit was amended. Instead of 2 small tubes, Beach was now authorized to excavate 1 large tunnel wherein the smaller tubes could reside, to simplify construction. Who requested the amendment? The historical record doesn't say. Beach later claimed he obtained it through normal legislative channels. Critics suggested Boss Tweed himself approved it, either because he didn't understand what Beach was planning or because he assumed any large tunnel project would eventually require Tammany's involvement and Tammany's percentage. Either way, the amendment created a legal gray zone. Beach had permission to dig a large tunnel. He did not have explicit permission to put passengers in it, but he also didn't have explicit prohibition. The question of what constituted legal construction versus illegal operation would depend on interpretation. And interpretation in 1870 New York was a political question, not a legal one. Beach built the tunnel at night to avoid interpretation entirely. If no one knew the tunnel existed until it was complete, no one could stop its construction. And if the tunnel was complete and open to the public before Tammany could mobilize opposition, public enthusiasm might protect it from political interference. This was not paranoia, it was calculation based on lived experience. By 1869, Beach had been navigating New York's political landscape for 2 decades. He was co-owner and editor of Scientific American, one of the most influential technical publications in the country. He was a patent lawyer who had secured patents for Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, and Cornelius Vanderbilt. He was a member of the Union League of New York, a Republican organization that opposed Tammany Hall's Democratic machine. He knew how the city worked. He knew that formal permission meant nothing if Tweed decided a project threatened his interests. He knew that construction permits could be revoked, that inspectors could find violations, that projects could be delayed indefinitely through bureaucratic obstruction. So he didn't ask for permission beyond what the amended permit provided. He just built. The legal structure of the Beach Pneumatic Transit Company reflected this strategy. The company was incorporated with Beach as president, but it had no outside investors during the construction phase. Beach funded the entire $350,000 himself, which meant no shareholders could demand transparency, no board could override his decisions, and no financial disclosures would reveal the project's scope until he chose to reveal it. This was expensive. $350,000 represented Beach's entire liquid fortune, money he had accumulated through Scientific American success and his patent law practice. He was betting everything on the assumption that a completed operational subway would generate enough public support to overcome political opposition. If he was wrong, he would be bankrupt. If Tweed moved to shut down the subway immediately after its opening, all that money would be lost. Beach understood the risk. He had watched other transit proposals die in committee, strangled by Tammany's procedural delays. In 1864, Hugh B. Wilson had proposed an underground railway from the Battery to Central Park to be built by private investors with no public funding. The proposal never made it out of the legislature. In 1866, Alfred Speer proposed a moving sidewalk that would run the length of Broadway on elevated tracks, powered by an endless belt. The legislature ignored it. In 1867, a group of engineers proposed a massive stone viaduct to carry trains above street level. Tweed expressed interest because a viaduct would require enormous construction contracts, all of which Tammany could control. But the viaduct was never built, probably because the engineers couldn't raise sufficient capital under the conditions Tweed demanded. Beach learned from these failures. If you proposed a project before building it, Tammany could kill it. If you built the project first and asked for expansion permission later, Tammany had to respond to public enthusiasm rather than bureaucratic inertia. The Pneumatic Subway's opening on February 26, 1870, was a calculated public relations event. Beach invited the press. He invited city officials. He invited anyone willing to pay 25 cents for a ride. The waiting room's opulence, the frescoes, the fountain, the grand piano, was designed to communicate that this was not a crude experiment, but a finished product, ready for immediate expansion. The charitable donation of all proceeds to war orphans was designed to make opposition politically toxic. It worked initially. Newspapers praised the subway's elegance and efficiency. The New York Times reported that visitors expected to find a dismal, cavernous retreat under Broadway, but instead opened their eyes at the elegant reception room, the light, airy tunnel, and équipes, the general appearance of taste and comfort. Within 2 weeks, 11,000 people had ridden the car. By the end of the first year, that number reached 400,000. But public enthusiasm didn't translate into political permission. When Beach introduced his expansion bill in January 1871, Tweed was ready. He had spent the intervening year consolidating power and preparing his counterproposal, the Viaduct Plan, which would cost 10 times what Beach's subway required and generate proportionally more opportunities for graft. The legislative battle revealed the limits of Beach's strategy. He had built the tunnel legally, under the amended permit, and operated it within a defensible interpretation of his charter. It was a demonstration, not a commercial transit line, which is why proceeds went to charity rather than shareholders. But legality didn't matter when the governor was Tweed's ally. Governor Hoffman vetoed Beach's expansion bill not because it was illegal, but because Tweed wanted it vetoed. Beach tried again in 1872. The legislature passed the bill again. Hoffman vetoed it again, this time claiming it granted too much authority to a private company without adequate compensation to the city or state. The veto message was legally coherent, even defensible, but everyone understood it was a political document, not a legal one. The third attempt came in 1873, after Tweed's arrest and conviction. The new governor, John A. Dix, signed the bill. Beach finally had legal authorization to expand the Pneumatic Subway from Warren Street to Central Park. But by then, the economy had collapsed. The Panic of 1873 had wiped out investment capital. Beach had spent his fortune lobbying for legislative approval. There was no money left to build. In late 1873, Dix withdrew the charter. The withdrawal was procedural. Beach had failed to raise the required funds within the specified time frame, but the effect was final. The Beach Pneumatic Transit Company no longer had permission to expand, and Beach no longer had the resources to fight for new permission. The tunnel was sealed, the company dissolved, the charter expired. What remained was the question of what the charter had actually authorized. Beach had built a tunnel for mail tubes, then put passengers in it. Was that legal? Arguably yes, since the tunnel existed for demonstration purposes and charged no commercial fares. Was it deceptive? Absolutely. Did the deception matter? Only insofar as it provoked Tweed's opposition, and Tweed's opposition mattered because he controlled the mechanisms of legal interpretation. In 1912, when the BMT workers broke into the sealed tunnel, they encountered a different legal question. Who owned it? The tunnel had been built by the Beach Pneumatic Transit Company, but the company no longer existed. Beach himself was dead. The Rogers Peet building, which had housed the station entrance, had burned down in 1898. Did the tunnel belong to Beach's heirs? To the city? To no one? The Yamaha successor to Beach's company, presumably someone who had acquired rights to the company's assets, sued the city for destroying the tunnel during subway construction. The lawsuit's outcome is unknown. It probably settled or was dismissed or simply faded into the bureaucratic archive. But the lawsuit's existence suggests that even 43 years after the tunnel's construction, the question of permission remained unresolved. Beach had built legally but ambiguously, operating in the space between explicit authorization and explicit prohibition. That space had been wide enough to construct a 312-foot tunnel and operate it for 3 years. But it had not been wide enough to expand the tunnel into an actual transit system because expansion required political permission, and political permission required either Tweed's cooperation or Tweed's destruction. Tweed was destroyed, arrested in 1871, convicted in 1873, imprisoned until his death in 1878. But his destruction came too late for Beach. By the time Tweed was gone, the economy had collapsed, Beach's fortune was spent, and the moment for pneumatic transit had passed. The geometry of permission had always been a trap. Build first, ask later. But later required capital, and capital required confidence, and confidence required stability, and stability was precisely what Tammany Hall had disrupted. Beach had navigated the trap brilliantly, constructing his tunnel in the narrow window between legal prohibition and political interference. But the window closed before he could escape through it. What remains is the plaque at City Hall Station, which credits Beach as the father of the subway, but does not mention the legal complexities that made his tunnel possible and expansion impossible. History simplified the story into a narrative of visionary inventor versus corrupt politician, genius versus greed. The actual story was more complicated. It was about the relationship between formal permission and informal power, about the difference between building legally and building successfully, about the question of whether innovation requires deception when the regulatory system is controlled by people who profit from preventing change. Beach answered that question by building in secret. The city answered by forgetting the tunnel existed. Neither answer resolved the underlying problem, which is why the question keeps recurring. What happens when the rules are designed to prevent exactly what the city needs? Pneumatic power was not a new idea in 1870, but it had never been used to move people at scale. The principle was simple: compress air in a confined space, and it will push objects through that space when released. Reverse the flow, and suction will pull objects back. For small parcels, letters, documents, small packages, the system worked efficiently. London had been operating pneumatic mail tubes since 1853, using compressed air to shoot capsules through underground pipes at speeds up to 30 miles per hour. The technology was proven, reliable, and relatively cheap to operate. Beach believed it could be scaled. Instead of capsules, he would move cars. Instead of tubes 3 inches in diameter, he would build tunnels 9 feet across. Instead of mail, he would transport passengers. The physics were identical, only the magnitude changed. This was where the economics became problematic. The Western Tornado, the 48-ton roots blower that powered Beach's subway, was driven by a 100-horsepower steam engine. The engine burned coal continuously while the subway operated, generating the steam that drove the blower. The blower forced 100,000 cubic feet of air per minute into the tunnel, creating enough pressure to push the 22-passenger car from Warren Street to Murray Street in about 30 seconds. When the car reached the end, baffles reversed, and the blower created a vacuum that pulled the car back. The system required constant energy input. Unlike horse-drawn streetcars, which only consumed oats when horses were actually working, the pneumatic subway's steam engine had to maintain pressure even when the car was stationary. This meant coal costs accrued continuously during operating hours, regardless of passenger volume. Beach never published detailed operating costs, but we can estimate. A 100-horsepower steam engine would consume roughly 1,000 pounds of coal per hour. In 1870, coal cost approximately $5 per ton in New York. Operating the subway for 12 hours per day would require 6 tons of coal, costing $30 per day, or roughly $11,000 per year. This doesn't include labor costs: engineers to maintain the engine, conductors to manage passengers, cleaners to maintain the waiting room, maintenance costs, replacing worn baffles, repairing the blower, maintaining the steam engine, or the cost of water for the steam engine and the fountain in the waiting room. Against these costs, Beach had zero revenue. All fares, 25 cents per passenger, went to charity. The subway was a demonstration, not a business. Beach was burning money to prove a concept, betting that public enthusiasm would generate political permission for expansion, and expansion would eventually generate profit. This was sustainable only as long as Beach's personal fortune lasted. And his fortune was finite. The $350,000 he spent on construction represented his accumulated wealth from Scientific American and his patent law practice. It was a significant sum, equivalent to roughly $827 million today. But it wasn't infinite. Operating costs would deplete his remaining capital quickly if expansion didn't materialize. By late 1870, Beach had been operating the subway for nearly a year. He had demonstrated that pneumatic transit worked. He had generated massive public enthusiasm, 400,000 riders in the first year. He had proven that underground construction could proceed without disrupting street traffic. He had shown that passengers preferred the clean, quiet pneumatic car to the filthy, chaotic horse-drawn streetcars above. But he had not generated revenue, and he had not secured expansion permission. The expansion plan called for extending the tunnel from Warren Street North to Central Park, approximately 5 miles. Using the existing tunnel's cost as a baseline, $350,000 for 312 feet, 5 miles would cost roughly $29 million. Beach wasn't planning to fund this himself. His business model required private investment. Wealthy New Yorkers would purchase shares in the Beach Pneumatic Transit Company. The company would build the expanded tunnel, and shareholders would profit from passenger fares once the system was operational. But private investment required confidence in the project's legal and political viability. And confidence evaporated when Governor Hoffman vetoed Beach's expansion bill in 1871. The veto signaled that Tammany Hall opposed the subway. This meant construction would face bureaucratic obstruction, regulatory harassment, and potential legal challenges. Investors understood that building in New York under Tammany opposition was expensive and risky. The county courthouse, which Tweed controlled, had already demonstrated how public works projects could be looted through padded contracts and cost overruns. Any subway project that required city permits, street access, or regulatory approval would be vulnerable to the same extraction. Beach had avoided this during the initial construction by building secretly and funding it himself. But expansion couldn't be secret. 5 miles of tunnel construction would require years of work, dozens of access points, coordination with other underground infrastructure, water mains, gas lines, sewer systems, and ongoing negotiations with city officials. Secrecy was impossible at that scale. So Beach needed Tammany's cooperation, or Tammany's destruction. He got neither in time. Tweed was arrested in October 1871, but the arrest didn't immediately break Tammany's power. The political machine continued to function under new leadership. Governor Hoffman remained in office until 1872. The regulatory apparatus that Tammany controlled, building inspectors, permit offices, city contracts, remained intact. Beach spent 1871 and 1872 lobbying for legislative approval. The legislature passed his expansion bill twice. Hoffman vetoed it twice. Beach was burning through his remaining capital on lobbying expenses, travel to Albany, legal fees, payments to political operatives who promised to deliver votes while the subway continued to operate at a loss. By 1873, when Governor Dix finally signed the expansion bill, Beach was financially exhausted, and the broader economy was collapsing. The Panic of 1873 began in September when J. Cook and Company, a major banking firm, failed due to overinvestment in railroad construction. The failure triggered a chain reaction. Banks called in loans, businesses defaulted, the stock market crashed, and investment capital disappeared. Within weeks, New York's financial markets had frozen. Wealthy investors who might have funded Beach's expansion were now trying to preserve their existing fortunes, not risk them on speculative infrastructure projects. Beach had 6 months under the new charter to raise the required capital and begin construction. He raised nothing. The 6-month deadline passed. Governor Dix withdrew the charter in late 1873, citing Beach's failure to meet the funding requirements. The Pneumatic Subway closed permanently. The tunnel was sealed. The company dissolved. Beach had spent $350,000 building the tunnel, plus additional capital operating it for 3 years and lobbying for expansion. He had generated zero revenue. He had proven that pneumatic transit was technically feasible but economically unviable under the existing political and financial conditions. The technical feasibility was real. The tunnel worked, the car moved, passengers loved it. But technical feasibility was necessary, not sufficient. Economic viability required revenue, and revenue required scale, and scale required expansion, and expansion required capital, and capital required political permission, and political permission required either Tweed's cooperation or Tweed's absence, and by the time Tweed was absent, the capital was gone. This is what the historical record often obscures. We remember Beach's tunnel as a triumph of American ingenuity, a proof of concept that validated underground transit and paved the way for the 1904 subway. And in a narrow technical sense, that's true. Beach demonstrated that tunnels could be built under Broadway without collapsing the street, that passengers would ride underground, that rapid transit was preferable to surface congestion. But in an economic sense, Beach's tunnel was a catastrophic failure. He spent his entire fortune building and operating a system that generated no revenue and no expansion. He proved that pneumatic power could move people, but not that it could do so profitably. He demonstrated that underground transit was possible, but not that it was sustainable under the legal and political conditions that governed New York in the 1870s. The 1904 subway, the real subway that eventually succeeded, used electric traction, not pneumatic power. It was funded through a public-private partnership, not private capital alone. It was built after Tammany Hall's power had declined significantly, after progressive reformers had introduced competitive bidding for city contracts, after labor unions had secured some basic protections for workers. It succeeded because the economic and political environment had changed, not because Beach's technical vision had been vindicated. What Beach proved was that innovation without economic viability is just expensive demonstration. The tunnel existed, the technology worked, but existence and functionality were not sufficient to overcome the structural barriers, political corruption, economic instability, capital scarcity, that prevented the system from scaling. In 1912, when workers found the sealed tunnel, they found a car that had carried 400,000 passengers and generated zero profit. They found a blower system that had consumed thousands of tons of coal to move people one block. They found a waiting room with goldfish and chandeliers, built to impress investors who never materialized. They found, in other words, evidence of how much money it costs to prove that an idea works when the people who control permission have no interest in letting it succeed. The workers removed the tunneling shield and donated it to Cornell University. The university lost it. Even the physical evidence of Beach's engineering achievement couldn't be preserved because engineering achievements that don't generate profit are considered curiosities, not assets worth protecting. What remains is the cost, $350,000, plus operating expenses, plus lobbying costs, plus Beach's personal depression after the failure, plus the opportunity cost of what else that money might have built if Beach had understood that technical feasibility and economic viability were different problems requiring different solutions. Air is free. Compressing it costs money. Moving people with compressed air costs more money. Scaling that system to citywide transit requires money that didn't exist under the conditions Beach faced. This is why pneumatic transit failed in 1873 and why electric traction succeeded in 1904. Not because one technology was better than the other, but because one economic model was viable and the other wasn't. Beach spent his fortune learning the difference. When the BMT workers broke through the brick wall in 1912, they found the waiting room exactly as Beach had left it 39 years earlier. The fountain was dry, but the basin remained intact. The goldfish were gone, dead decades ago, their bodies presumably decomposed or removed before the tunnel was sealed. The grand piano stood in the corner, its ivories untouched by moisture. The frescoed walls showed no water damage, no mold, no evidence of the decay that usually accompanies abandoned underground spaces. The air, according to contemporary accounts, was warm and dry. This detail is worth examining. The tunnel had been sealed in 1873. No fresh air had entered for 39 years. No maintenance had been performed. No one had pumped out water, repaired leaks, or prevented the kind of deterioration that normally destroys underground structures within decades. Yet the waiting room remained preserved, as if time had simply stopped when the door closed. The preservation suggests something about the tunnel's construction. Beach had built it well. The brick lining was watertight. The drainage was sufficient to prevent flooding. The location, under Broadway, above the water table, was dry enough that seepage wasn't a problem. These weren't accidents. They were design choices, implemented during construction, that created a space capable of surviving abandonment. But design can only explain so much. The piano in particular is difficult to account for. Pianos are wood, felt, wire, and ivory, materials that decay rapidly in uncontrolled humidity. Even in ideal conditions, pianos require regular tuning and maintenance. A piano abandoned in a sealed underground room for 39 years should have warped, cracked, and become unplayable. Yet the 1912 accounts describe it as intact, suggesting it had survived remarkably well. One explanation is that the accounts exaggerated. Newspapers in 1912 loved the story of the forgotten subway, and they may have dramatized the tunnel's condition to emphasize the romance of rediscovery. The piano may have been damaged but recognizable, which journalists reported as intact because it made for a better story. Another explanation is that the tunnel's environment was genuinely exceptional, dry, stable, sealed against the elements in ways that prevented normal decay. This would be consistent with Beach's engineering approach. He had built the tunnel to demonstrate that underground transit was viable, which meant proving that underground spaces could be maintained. A tunnel that flooded or deteriorated would undermine his entire argument. So he engineered it to last. But there's a third explanation, darker and more speculative. The waiting room was preserved because it was always intended to be a monument, not a functional space. Consider the investment Beach made in aesthetics. The frescoed walls, the fountain with goldfish, the grand piano, the upholstered settees, the chandeliers. None of this was necessary for a demonstration. Subway. A simple waiting area with benches would have sufficed to prove that passengers could board safely. The opulence was strategic. It communicated that underground transit could be elegant, not just functional. It reassured wealthy investors that the subway wouldn't be a dark, filthy hole, but a civilized space worthy of their capital. But the opulence also suggested something else. It suggested that Beach understood, perhaps unconsciously, that the waiting room might never evolve into an actual transit station. It might remain exactly what it was, a single room built to impress, visited by tourists rather than commuters, operating for a few years before economic and political realities forced it to close. If Beach suspected this outcome, if he understood that expansion was unlikely given Tammany's opposition and the precarious state of New York's finances, then the waiting room's design makes a different kind of sense. It wasn't built to be functional at scale. It was built to be memorable at a small scale, to create an impression that would outlast the subway's brief operation. This interpretation is speculative, but it's consistent with Beach's behavior after the tunnel closed. He sealed it. He didn't demolish it, didn't salvage the materials, didn't try to repurpose the space. He simply locked the door and walked away. This suggests he wanted it preserved, either because he hoped to reopen it someday or because he wanted it to endure as evidence of what might have been. The preservation worked. When the BMT workers found the tunnel in 1912, it was still legible as Beach's creation. The car, the shield, the piano. All of it communicated that a specific person had built a specific thing for a specific purpose, even though that purpose had failed. But legibility and functionality are not the same. The waiting room was readable as a waiting room, but it was no longer usable as one. The goldfish were dead. The piano was untuned. The fountain was dry. The gas lamps couldn't be lit because the gas supply had been disconnected decades earlier. The space was a museum of itself, preserved but inert. This is what happens to infrastructure when it's abandoned before it becomes essential. The 1904 subway, built 34 years after Beach's tunnel, became essential immediately. Within months, it was carrying hundreds of thousands of passengers daily. It couldn't be abandoned because the city depended on it. Maintenance was continuous because failure would paralyze commerce. The infrastructure survived because people needed it to survive. Beach's tunnel never reached that threshold. It was a curiosity, not a necessity. When it closed, the city didn't notice. Passengers returned to horse-drawn streetcars and elevated trains. Broadway remained congested, but no more congested than before. The tunnel's absence changed nothing, which is why it could be forgotten so completely. The BMT workers' rediscovery in 1912 briefly revived interest. Newspapers published articles. Engineers examined the tunnel. The New York Historical Society commissioned a plaque. But the tunnel itself was destroyed to make way for the new subway. Its bricks were broken, its alignment incorporated into the Broadway line, its physical existence erased. Only the memory remained, and even the memory was selective. The story that survived was about Beach's genius and Tweed's corruption, about visionary innovation versus political obstruction. The story that disappeared was about economic failure, about a man who spent his fortune building something nobody needed badly enough to save. The waiting room in this sense was always a mausoleum. It wasn't built for the living passengers who used it from 1870 to 1873. It was built for the future passengers who would never arrive, for the expanded system that would never be constructed, for the version of New York where pneumatic transit succeeded. When those futures failed to materialize, the waiting room became a tomb for Beach's ambition. The goldfish swimming in the fountain were the only living things in the room, and even they were ornamental, creatures kept alive for aesthetic purposes, not functional ones. When the tunnel closed, they died. When the workers found the room in 1912, the goldfish were gone, but the fountain remained, dry and empty, still shaped to hold water it would never hold again. This is infrastructure at its most melancholy, spaces built for futures that don't arrive, maintained through inertia or accident, rediscovered by people who have no use for them. The BMT workers needed the tunnel's space, not its history. They tore it apart to build the Broadway line, which succeeded where Beach's tunnel failed because it was built under different economic and political conditions, conditions that Beach had helped create by demonstrating that underground transit was possible, even if he couldn't make it profitable. The plaque at City Hall Station acknowledges Beach's contribution, but plaques are for tourists and historians, not commuters. The people who ride the N&R trains through the Broadway line don't know they're passing through the approximate location of Beach's waiting room. They don't know about the fountain, the piano, the frescoes. They don't know that the tunnel they're riding through was built by destroying another tunnel that once carried 400,000 people, and then sat empty for 39 years, perfectly preserved, waiting for a future that never came. What they know, what the infrastructure teaches them through daily use, is that the subway works. It moves people. It's essential. It survives because it's needed. This is the lesson Beach never learned. Infrastructure that isn't essential doesn't survive, no matter how well it's built. The waiting room was a mausoleum from the moment it opened, because it was built for a future that required political permission Beach couldn't obtain and economic conditions that didn't exist. The piano waited in. The corner for 39 years. No one played it. No one tuned it. No one sat on the bench and wondered what song might fill the space. It just waited, perfectly preserved, until workers tore down the walls and let time resume. Alfred Ely Beach lived for 23 years after his tunnel closed, and during that time, he changed. Friends and colleagues noticed it. His conversations, once sharp and ranging, became gentler, less incisive. His observations, previously acute and often witty, grew softer, more forgiving. He continued his work at Scientific American, continued his patent law practice, continued inventing. He developed a typewriter for the blind and a system for heating water with solar power. But the energy that had driven him to build a secret tunnel under Broadway was gone. What replaced it is harder to name. It wasn't despair exactly. Beach didn't collapse into depression and abandon his work. He remained productive, respected, socially active. But something fundamental had shifted. The man who had risked his entire fortune on a demonstration project, who had defied Boss Tweed by building in secret, who had lobbied the legislature for 3 consecutive years, that man had been replaced by someone quieter, more cautious, perhaps more resigned. The historical record doesn't provide diagnosis, and speculation about Beach's interior life would be inappropriate without evidence. But the external facts suggest a pattern. After 1873, Beach never attempted another large-scale infrastructure project. He never proposed another transit system. He never challenged political power directly. He focused on smaller inventions, technical improvements, editorial work, projects that required creativity and expertise, but not confrontation with the systems that had defeated his tunnel. This could be interpreted as wisdom. Beach had learned that technical brilliance wasn't sufficient to overcome structural barriers. He had learned that innovation without political permission and economic viability was just expensive demonstration. He had learned, in other words, the limits of individual agency within systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of disruption he had attempted. Or it could be interpreted as defeat. Beach had built the future and watched it close. He had proven that underground transit was possible and been denied permission to implement it at scale. He had spent his fortune, won public enthusiasm, and still failed because the people who controlled permission had no interest in his success. That kind of defeat, comprehensive, structural, irreversible, could easily drain a person's appetite for future battles. What's clear is that Beach never publicly discussed the tunnel's failure in detail. He didn't write a memoir explaining what went wrong. He didn't publish a technical paper analyzing why pneumatic transit couldn't scale economically. He didn't mount a public campaign blaming Tweed or Hoffman or the Panic of 1873. He just moved on, quietly, focusing on work that didn't require him to risk everything again. In 1896, Beach died of pneumonia at age 69. The obituaries noted his contributions to Scientific American, his patents, his role in supporting technical education. Some mentioned the Pneumatic Subway, briefly, as an interesting footnote in New York's transit history. None suggested it was his most important achievement. None suggested it had cost him everything. By 1896, New York was actively planning the subway system that would open in 1904. The Rapid Transit Commission had been established in 1894. Engineers were designing the route, securing funding, preparing to dig. The system would use electric traction, not pneumatic power. It would be built through a public-private partnership, not private capital alone. It would operate under a regulatory framework that had evolved significantly since the 1870s, incorporating some of the progressive reforms that had weakened Tammany's grip on city contracts. Beach's tunnel was already forgotten. The Rogers Peat Building had burned in 1898, 2 years after Beach's death, destroying the physical entrance to the station. The tunnel itself was sealed somewhere under Broadway, its exact location uncertain, its existence known only to a handful of engineers and historians who had read Beach's 1870 pamphlet or remembered the brief excitement when the subway opened. The city didn't need Beach's tunnel anymore. It was building a better one, using better technology, under better political conditions. Beach's contribution, proving that underground transit was viable, had been absorbed into the collective knowledge that made the 1904 subway possible. But the contribution was anonymous now, credited generally to early transit experiments rather than specifically to Alfred Ely Beach and his $350,000 gamble. This is how infrastructure failure works. The attempt is expensive and visible. the failure is quiet and forgettable. The lessons are absorbed without attribution. The person who paid to generate those lessons is erased from the story, remembered only in plaques and footnotes, if at all. When the BMT workers found the tunnel in 1912, Beach had been dead for 16 years. He wasn't alive to see his waiting room rediscovered. He wasn't alive to explain why he had built it, what he had hoped it would become, what it felt like to watch it close. He wasn't alive to contest the narrative that would develop around the tunnel, the story of visionary genius defeated by corrupt politics, of innovation thwarted by greed. That narrative is partially true, but it's also incomplete. Tweed did oppose Beach. Political corruption did make expansion impossible during the early 1870s. But the Panic of 1873 would have killed the project even if Tweed had never existed. The economics of pneumatic transit were always problematic. The business model required expansion to achieve profitability. But expansion required capital, and capital required investor confidence, and investor confidence required political stability and regulatory predictability. Conditions that didn't exist in New York during the 1870s and wouldn't exist until progressive reforms in the 1890s created a more transparent governance structure. Beach understood this eventually. That's probably why he stopped fighting. Not because Tweed won, but because Beach recognized that the structural conditions necessary for his tunnel to succeed didn't exist and wouldn't exist within his lifetime. Building the tunnel had been possible. Operating it as a demonstration had been possible. Scaling it to citywide transit was not possible under the political and economic systems that governed New York in his era. This recognition that you can be right about the future, but too early to implement it, is a particular kind of tragedy. Beach was correct that underground transit would eventually succeed. He was correct that pneumatic power could move people safely and efficiently. He was correct that New York needed rapid transit to address its congestion crisis. But being correct about all of this didn't matter because the systems that controlled implementation weren't designed to reward correctness. They were designed to extract profit, maintain political control, and resist disruption. Beach spent his fortune trying to disrupt those systems. The systems won. Not because they were better or smarter or more innovative, but because they had structural power and Beach had only individual capital. He could build a tunnel. He couldn't change the rules that determined whether the tunnel could expand. After his death, the rules changed, slowly, incompletely, but enough that the 1904 subway could succeed where Beach's tunnel failed. Progressive reformers limited Tammany's power. Competitive bidding reduced contract corruption. Labor unions secured basic protections. Electric traction proved more economically viable than pneumatic power. Public-private partnerships distributed risk in ways that pure private investment couldn't. None of this vindicated Beach personally. He wasn't alive to see it. His tunnel wasn't preserved as proof of concept. His financial losses weren't compensated. His contribution wasn't formally acknowledged in the 1904 subway's opening ceremonies. What survived was the tunnel itself for 39 years, sealed and forgotten. And then even that didn't survive. The BMT workers tore it apart to build the Broadway line, which incorporated Beach's space without acknowledging his engineering, used his route without crediting his vision, succeeded where he failed without explaining why the conditions that destroyed his tunnel no longer applied to theirs. The plaque came later, 1932, 36 years after Beach's death, 20 years after the tunnel was destroyed. The New York Historical Society commissioned it, placed it at the City Hall station, acknowledged Beach as the father of New York's subway. The gesture was well-intentioned, but historically imprecise. Beach wasn't the father of the subway that actually succeeded. He was the father of the subway that failed, the one that proved underground transit was viable, but not that it was economically sustainable or politically achievable under 1870s conditions. Calling him the father of the subway erases the distinction between technical proof of concept and systemic implementation. It suggests that Beach's tunnel led directly to the 1904 subway, when in fact the two projects succeeded under fundamentally different conditions using fundamentally different technologies and business models. The connection is conceptual, not causal. Beach proved it could be done. The 1904 engineers proved it could be done profitably, at scale, under regulatory conditions that had evolved significantly since Beach's era. The plaque doesn't mention any of this. It doesn't mention the $350,000 Beach lost. It doesn't mention the 23 years he lived after the tunnel closed, years in which his personality softened and his ambition narrowed. It doesn't mention that the tunnel was forgotten so completely that its rediscovery in 1912 surprised everyone, including engineers who thought they knew every detail of underground Manhattan. What the plaque does is allow contemporary subway riders to feel good about the past without confronting its complexity. Beach was a genius. Tweed was corrupt. Progress triumphed eventually. The story is clean, inspirational, reassuring. The truth is messier. Beach was brilliant but miscalculated the economic viability of pneumatic transit. Tweed was corrupt but not solely responsible for the tunnel's failure. Progress didn't triumph so much as conditions changed enough that a different approach could succeed. The 1904 subway wasn't Beach's vindication. It was evidence that infrastructure requires political, economic, and technological alignment, and Beach had only achieved the technological part. He died before learning whether that was enough.